Welcome back to Most Self-Improved, a podcast where we're trying to be just a little bit better, focusing on how we can lead engaged, fulfilled lives that bring you joy. I'm Erin Jensen with my lovely co-host, Bhavana Chilukuri.
Hi, everyone.
For this episode, we are speaking with therapist Leah Marone all about adult friendships. I remember a time in my 20s when my friends were my everything. We were each other's everything. And then some of them moved away. We got jobs. Some started families. So today we're going to talk about evolving expectations of friendships, loneliness, how to make new friends later in life, and healthy ways to resolve conflict. Let's get started by welcoming Leah to the podcast. We're so excited to have you. Aren't we so excited?
We are. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
To get started, why don't you tell us, Leah, about your areas of expertise and your approach?
Sure. So I'm a psychotherapist by trade. I specialize in anxiety disorders and mood disorders as well. I mean, as we know, anxiety and kind of depression and kind of under that umbrella go hand in hand, unfortunately. But I have a sweet spot working with athletes. I myself was an athlete and anxiety ridden. And so I have a sweet spot for that. And so work with, collegiate athletes and pro athletes and high school athletes that are kind of making their way to those arenas. But yeah, anything that has to do with anxiety, OCD, and I really, perfectionism, relationships, and kind of around grief as well. So clinically, that's kind of where I hover. And then the other side of my profession is a mental wellness consultant for corporations and nonprofits. And I work a lot with educators on boundary setting, on self-awareness training, resilience training, and really just kind of cultural shifts, whether it's in nonprofits or organizations.
Well, we are so excited to have you. I also specialize in anxiety and having it. So I love that you specialize in lessening it. So we're so excited to have you here. Leah Marone, how do we benefit from having friendships?
Well, I think just the big answer to that is we're all wired for connection. And of course, connection comes in all different forms. But I think those peer relationships, I think we hope, and I think they do generate a lot of laughter, generate a lot of humor, right? And connection in a way that many of us, especially when it is a peer and it's a friendship, we're going through similar things or similar chapters. They can come in different forms and look different ways, but I think there's that relatability. We have that vision, those lenses that we try to relate to and bond with. So there's just, at any age, you look at elementary kids just laughing it up on the playground. And it kind of, as we move through our teen years and all our adult years, those peer relationships and that bonding and validation is huge and essential for our well-being, connection.
What you said about us being wired for connection, that's just so true about being human. But when I think about what the world looks like today, are we all getting that connection we need, or are we getting lonelier? Like, what have you seen and what are you observing about our world today?
Yeah, that's a great point. And, I think about it in the middle versus all or nothing. And I do. I think there's a the way we're operating, the way our culture is, it is kind of pushing more of that isolation. Unfortunately, it's kind of fabricating these connections, these acquaintances. But in reality, I think a lot of us are out of shape when it comes to just in-person connection, whether it's even with strangers or even in a waiting room or even on the airplane. And I know me, myself, sometimes I look at those experiences, especially on an airplane, like, I don't know if I want to connect with anyone. I want to read my book and I want to use this as recovery. And I kind of set those internal boundaries. But we think about, and we're all guilty of it, when we are sitting in a waiting room, when we're in places where there are opportunities, even for like smiles and exchanges, we're missing out on those because we're so focused on this a lot of times, right? We're training our brains to kind of have that continuous stimulation. Did someone message me? Is there something to structure me? Is there a distraction? Is there this false sense of connection that we're missing these opportunities in real time? And they might not be these deep, intimate things because they might be with people we don't necessarily know, but even neighbors, even people where we can get that energy exchange and just be present with who we're with and what the current environment has. I think we're incredibly out of shape with that.
Why do you think we're out of shape? Is part of it COVID? Is, like you said, we're so into our own thing? What is it?
I think it's just lack of reps. I think a lot of it, it's not just to blame it on the devices. It's not just to blame, but everything's so convenient with that. There's not that patience game with things as much as there was. It's not that creativity with how am I going to fill this space or who's around to help me fill this space. It's more so, no, I have everything I need right here in front of me, and this is what I'm going to do. I think COVID played a role, but I think it also ignited some creativity for different types of connection. But it did. We lacked that in-person connection at times. I think a lot of people, which I loved, and I know I did as well, is we'd meet outside, right? Which again, just being outside and having that distance. And these were the boundaries that were set, and we kind of worked within them. And some of those things were wonderful. I can even remember my neighborhood saying, hey, pull up a lawn chair and let's have our distance, but we're going to have a little powwow. And I was like, that was fantastic. And we didn't do that before. And we honestly haven't kept it up after.
That's so true. And I love the example you gave of your just meeting outside with your neighbors. So many people don't even talk to their neighbors, but those are the only people you could talk to, right? And I'll always maintain dating during COVID was my favorite thing, just because I feel like all these guys were terrified they were going to be alone and started to become very real. So they really brought it out with the picnic date. So that's a good reminder to talk to the person in the waiting room or on the airplane.
I said at the start of this podcast that there's a time in your 20s when your friendships, they feel like everything. Your parents have dropped you off and you're kind of trying to figure it out on your own, and they really are like a lifeline. And then that can sort of start to change in your 30s if they're moving, if they're in a different phase of life than you. How does getting older affect our friendships?
Yeah, it certainly does. And to your point, I think it depends on the circumstances, whether you're in a situation in life where you are constantly relocating due to a job, due to other things, and that's just fine. It's hard to find your footing. It's hard to build those roots. Maybe you're not interested in building roots. Other people might be settling down. There's just this variation that can happen where if you think about when a lot of us were school age or going through school, whether it's traditional or not, we all had similar schedules. We all had similar bubbles. There was more access and ease a lot of times with oh, this is how you make friends. This is what I have, and this is what I'm going to work with. And I think as we move through these different chapters of adulthood, people have different viewpoints of what they need, the energy they're expending, the energy they'd like to receive from others, if at all. And it's more limited, I think, because those bubbles are bigger. They're different. So I think that can be very confusing. That can be daunting. I think our energy levels too shift. When we're teenagers, it's like the sky's the limit. I feel like we're just running with a full tank of gas all the time, a lot of us, And I think that as we age, even in our 30s, we're still young, but there's a shift and we're working harder and our values may have shifted, our priorities may have shifted, and finding someone that may align with those can be quite a challenge, and it requires a vulnerability that becomes, I think, a little more complicated and daunting. And again, we're out of shape with as we get older.
I'm going to speak from my perspective. So single woman, no children, never married, available, DMs are open, but I have a lot of friends who are married. It's just different. So how can you deal with feeling left behind or in these different stages? How can you maintain these friendships?
Yeah. Well, I think too, it's communication, right? There's some communication, and it's very intricate, I think, how you present those things. But I think to also acknowledge that there is a bit of grieving that happens. The space has been filled up in a lot of ways with other priorities and other things. In your situation, there's an element of grief to that. Logically, you get it. It makes sense. And this is a common thing, and I understand it. But emotionally, it's hard to wrap our head around it. You miss those exchanges, you miss those times. And I think that open-mindedness, that conversation, communicating how you feel without projecting that guilt is something that we lack. And I think when we don't communicate that, sometimes that builds resentment. Sometimes that builds, feelings inside that we kind of keep convincing ourselves, we're fine. It is what it is. But as you know, that only works for so long. Then the work that coincides with grief, what am I going to do with this space? How am I going to make this shift along with the reality of what's happening and things that I can't control and actually I'm excited about, but also know that I'm going to have some transitions with. And I think that's really important. And I think to speak to anxiety on that level, anytime we have a transition, whether it's a work change, a friendship change, just anything where our space has shifted and we may have some potential gaps. You finish a project, you finish this. A lot of times we don't strategically think about what am I going to fill this with? And that's not to jam pack yourself and be rigid, But a lot of times when we aren't continuing the learning process, when we're not taking these risks, when we're not filling this space deliberately, anxiety moves in and occupies that, because guess what? Anxiety is incredibly stimulating. And if we're not stimulating enough, anxiety is like, oh, this is me front and center. Where's the spotlight? And this is not the type of stimulation we like, but hey, anxiety keeps those motors going.
Let's talk about that more. Let's get into that. What? Because I feel like that's a big thing. Tell us more how anxiety feels enticing then in that way, and what we can do about it, how we can fill that space that relationship formerly occupied.
Yeah. Well, I think too, if I just speak personally about that, I've noticed that if I do have something that has ended or I've finished, even if it was a celebratory thing, and I'm like, oh gosh, I spent so much energy and effort in that, and that's over. So I have learned that I do have to think, what's next? Because if I don't, and just naturally, even if we have high levels of self-awareness and we're kind of clearing our own clutter proactively, we're all carrying around like these suppression bubbles. We're all carrying around things that if we're not mindful of cleaning out, if you will, they're going to find an opening. And whether that's, in the middle of the night at 2 a.m., whether that's when we just have space in a chapter of our lives, like our bodies and minds want to clear that clutter. And so I think for me, sometimes I've noticed, why is my anxiety like peaking right now? Is there something that has triggered it? And sometimes I'm like, I can't really find that. I just feel off. Sometimes I will assess, is there enough that I'm actually learning? Is there enough that I'm actually contributing to or challenging myself with? Because if not, anxiety is like, oh, we'll challenge you. Here we come. And so again, it's not that extreme of let me keep my calendar completely full and never have check-ins and try to avoid anxiety at all costs. That's not it. It's more so that propelling yourself into that continuous motion of learning and being curious and taking these risks. And we've heard this before, but it's so critical when it comes to anxiety management.
I haven't heard it before. I loved it. I enjoy that answer very much.
I think it's so true that when there is that shift or transition, there's going to be grief. And so many of us try to skip over that part. And then the anxiety comes in. But I'm wondering, we're both in our 30s, even as our friendships are changing all around us in different ways, depending on where we are. At the base of it all, what does being a good friend mean to you through any change? What should we expect of our friends?
Ooh, and really, honestly, before I answer that, I'd love to hear your answers on that. Just in one sentence, what would you all say? Just to give me a premise here. That's a great question.
I was going to say, because I feel like the question at the base is like, how do we set expectations of our friends, right? So, Bob, you had the great question. You go first.
Yeah. At the foundation of it all, I just want to know that I can call the person when I need them, and that I can be myself in front of them and they'll receive me in that way, in that moment, in the way that I need. There's lots of extras with that, like the laughter, as you mentioned, is such an important part of friendship for me. But I think so much of our society tells you have that one romantic partner to lean on. And I didn't have that for a really long time. So just because I have one now, I don't want to put everything on him. So having a circle of people around me that can receive me feels like what I need from a friend.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Sounds like you're craving that, which I think we all do. It was beautifully worded. Just that authenticity and that space to be vulnerable and accepted, right? A place where you can kind of bypass some of the small talk, the courtesies, just really get
Hate
into
that.
it. Yeah.
Hate the small talk. But yeah, what about the two of you?
Like you mentioned, the dependability and being able to rely on someone, or if you make plans that they're not going to ditch you. So I think dependability, and then also, like you said, a security to be able to be emotionally raw and know that they're going to keep whatever secrets and trust that you have. And then also that whatever they say to you is going to come from a good place. And I think growth and challenge is also fun for friendship. But I think the two things, like you said, do I feel safe and can I trust them and be myself? And then also, can we rely on them to show up?
Absolutely. And I think everyone would have a slightly different answer, but it all hovers around that craving and that need for authentic connection, right? But I think for me too, it's the ability to be present, the ability to be an active listener. Most of us, whether right or wrong, claim to be good listeners, And not to say we're always good listeners at every point in every conversation we're in, because sometimes our balloon's full, right? And we got to be mindful of that. But I think overall, when some of my best friendships and friendships moments are when there's that compatibility, I think, in sharing. And it's that self-awareness around not being quick to turn the focus and turn the energy. And what I mean by that is one of the best ways we know how to bond with someone when they share news is to immediately relate it to ourselves. Oh my God, that happened to me last week too. Or yes, I dated someone and da 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 da. And we flip the script. And it's not malicious. It's a way to, in a lot of ways, to be like, you're not alone. I felt that too. But what that does, especially to people that are categorized as more so introverts, it takes that space and they go right back into the listener role. And it was so interesting. I'm actually going to share a story. In high school, for me, I grew up with a few girls, since kindergarten. And I had known one of my friends since then. And in high school, I remember we were on the same basketball team and we were on our bus trip back from a game. And she loved to share everything going on in her life. And we'd all sit there and we'd be educated by her and what's happening and who she's dating. And we'd just sit there. But I remember one time she asked me a question. And I started to answer. And then she goes, you know what? Hold up. She's like, Leah, I've known you for years. And I feel like I really don't know you. And I was like, oh. And of course, I, started processing that and thinking like, do I share enough? Am I a closed book? And then I was thinking, no, I feel like if someone asks me a question, I'd like to share. And I started to really think about this. And I noticed then with my group of friends that when I was asked a question or I started to talk, somebody would immediately relate and get very excited. And it would find me back in the listener role, which I like. What I do for a living. I like to listen. I like to. So I didn't mind. It wasn't like, I never get to talk. I felt safer in that role, to be honest. I didn't have to really play with vulnerability, but I lost out on some reps, right? And I remember that. And I've even shared that now in adulthood, I think, with some of my friends. And they're attuned to it. And so sometimes they'll start and they'll be like, you know what, finish. Tell me what you're thinking. And it's been so wonderful to have friends that have created that space and challenge vulnerability on my end, because I am one that's like, oh, I'm fine being in the listener role. But I think that's a big thing. It's like prematurely giving advice, prematurely relating. And sometimes our conversations are choppy and therefore don't get to that deeper, intimate level that I know all of us are craving because of just that conversational intelligence.
And so you mentioned the idea of like your bubble filling up. I don't know if this relates to that or if you want to explain a little bit further of what that is, but in prioritizing friendships, how much time or how much bubble, if I'm understanding it, should we be devoting to friendships?
Ooh, yeah, that's a great one. I think too, and I know it sounds a little like strategic, maybe more so than needed to, with kind of this like flow that we just want to have, authentic flow with friendships, but really understanding what our goals are and what we hope to get out of saying yes to things. Is it more so that pleaser comes out on us? We're like, well, I haven't seen them for 2 weeks, so I probably should do that. Or I should probably do this, and we're more so in that role in a relationship where we're the pleaser, we're kind of the caretaker, and we may feel a little depleted afterward. And then there's not that balance energy kind of happening. And then there's those friendships too, where them, you're with somebody and you're like, I feel ignited. I always feel like I gained some energy. I feel like inspired. It was a really good time. We were present. We didn't even have shit planned, but we figured it out and it was so much fun. And so I think it's, again, just knowing and checking in with where you're at. How full is your balloon? What can you give? Are you authentic with that? Are you setting appropriate boundaries, or are you setting yourself up to be in these roles in friendships where you're just giving and taking false ownership and then depleted and then feel like, well, this is just how our relationship is, so I guess I need to continue it. Like, that's exhausting. And so being really true and real, I think, with the roles that you typically find yourself in friendships, and if it's working, is a huge question we need to be asking ourselves.
And we're going to get into that. Can you first tell us about this balloon and what all we have put in the balloon and how big is the balloon?
Well, let me just relate it to like being in traffic. Okay. And what I mean by that is we all have this balloon in our belly, let's just say. And that there's some days that you're driving on the highway or driving somewhere and someone may cut you off and you lose it. You're in your car and you're having a tantrum. There's other days where you're just like, hey, go ahead. Our levels sometimes are up and down, and we react. Our ability to emotionally regulate in situations like that depend, I think, on how full our balloon is. And so if you think about throughout the day, these little things that really may really not mean much in the big scheme of things, like, oh, they got my order wrong, or, oh, things where it's like they're fluid, they're going to pass. But these little things sometimes give us just little puffs of air. And then someone may smile at us, something may go well, and we release a little bit of air. Mm-hmm. And if we have good self-care practices, if we're checking in with ourselves, we're letting air out. It's those of us, and I know we've all been there, where we're walking around with a full balloon and we're just shoving it down. We're flying by the seat of our pants. We're looking for distractions. Our inner critic is blazing and it's just like, go, 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 fight, fight, fight. And, the last little puff of air, we pop. And that pop can look different depending on where you're at and who you're with and what the trigger was. But I think it's such an important concept, checking in with how full is my balloon? And, am I prone to popping here in the next day or two? And if so, what am I trying to do to relieve some of that air? What am I trying to do to recover? Or is that even something that I'm, again, giving myself permission to do and to even assess?
How do you think geographical distance affects friendships? I read a study once where it said there's 3 ingredients crucial to friendship. So proximity, you're just close to the people. Repeated unplanned interactions. They're just there. You don't have to plan it. And then an environment where you can let your guard down. That's like college, right? Those 3 things. And then I don't know that there's another environment after college where you get those 3 things, right? I certainly don't have it as someone who works remotely. And my friends are all over the country. So we try for like a girls' trip every year, now every 2 years with kids and all of that. So what do you think that people can do when they live far apart but still really love each other?
Yes, I know. I think it's, again, you kind of work with what you have. And I know it's hard when one person in that relationship feels like maybe they are always the structurer. They are the one trying to arrange. And so that can be a challenge, I know. But I think it does. Especially if it's such an intimate relationship, if there's a good foundation, I think it warrants some of those discussions. Like, hey, we're going to be grieving because you're moving across the country and I'm really excited for you, but man, I'm going to miss you and you're not going to be accessible. Having those interactions and then kind of brainstorming what works for us and touching base with those things. I think that's really important. And I think sometimes we're reactive to it rather than proactive. And then that's when feelings get hurt and we feel distance. And then we bring it up and somebody already has their space filled with other things. And it's hard to anticipate all of that, right? Mm-hmm. But again, it's that communication piece. It's that self-awareness around, this is a shift. I mean, we all experienced that. Those of us that did go to college, we had our core crew, right? We had our people we lived with or people that we saw all the time, and just fun, just oozed out of us. It was great. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait, you work nights and I work here and I work 80 hours a week. And it's really hard. But I think it's, again, working with what you have and having that dual effort, which is tough. I'm working with a lot of clients right now in their 20s that are going through a lot of this. And there's a huge growing pains that happens, to your point, after college, because all the timelines shift, everything kind of shifts, the accessibility shifts. And so it's acknowledging that grief. It's inspiring them to take risks elsewhere, get some reps in elsewhere with cultivating new relationships. But again, how do we keep those old ones? And some of them sadly end. That's just the reality.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them, and that's unfortunate, but I think that's the reality too. And so it's sometimes acknowledging that is a common thing as well.
We thought this episode was about friendship. It's about grief. It's clearly about grief. But we talked a little bit about this before, conflict. When the stakes are high, when you love your friends so much, when you care about them, how do we resolve conflict in a way that you and your feelings are communicated, heard, not in a hurtful way, and then, yay, we get to be friends and it's not like we had a big scary confrontation. How do we do it? And obviously from the words I'm using, you can tell I'm so anxious talking about conflict.
Yes. And that's a multi-layered. As you were talking, I was like, I think everyone can kind of relate and pinpoint someone. I think first and foremost, and again, this sounds kind of strategic, but it's almost like identifying for yourself and maybe perhaps with each other, what's the goal of this conversation? Is the goal of this conversation for us to kind of reach a resolution? Is it to hear each other? Is it to just vent? What is the goal of this conversation? Because a lot of times what happens is our ego comes out and we get in this mode where it's like, no, I'm right. And I'm going to convince you why. And guess what? They're of the same mindset. So it's just this back and forth. I mean, we see this with our partners, our intimate partners too, right? We're missing that step of validation. We're missing that step of paraphrasing. We're missing that step of creating space for each other rather than letting our ego jump in and be like, yeah, you're totally wrong. And this is why, and this is my viewpoint. Because then you're both of that mindset. So if you think about validation, and I've done some couples counseling in the past, I'm very, it's very rare now because it's a lot. I'll tell you that it's a lot, but it is about validating. It's about remembering like, hey, we're on the same team here. We're not necessarily against each other, depending on the situation, but we are missing that step of truly and actively listening. This is what I heard you say, or this is the emotion that I'm pulling out of the words that you're using right now. You may not agree with any of them. You may think that's a bunch of bullshit, but in order to align, in order to like progress in the conversation, we forget to validate. We forget to acknowledge what we're hearing. And I think that's a big thing that you can start modeling in a conversation, or just even checking in with like, what did you hear me say? Did that make sense? So that you're again working together and chipping away at things rather than again falling into this, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm right, you're wrong, this is how, and it escalates and then we're angry and it's hard to calm down. And then we remove ourselves and we come back and then the whole cycle is just, there we go.
If someone is not open to the feedback or begins to get very defensive when you try to say in a polite, nice way, or not in any sort of antagonistic way or provocative way, I'm feeling this way, and they are not open to hearing it at all, then what do you do?
Yeah. Well, you started to say something really important because you started with the I statement, right? I feel, and that's great. That's like, that does wonders. And I think we all conceptually know that. We've heard it, but it's really hard to execute in real time. I think when we are doing that, and those friends, those people, and sometimes we are those people where we are just, our balloon is almost full. And so when we come into that conversation, we're already there. And so guns blazing, we're ready to go. We're like out for blood. And so it's hard to regulate. But that's where if you see that in your friend or know like, they have a tendency to get really hot real quick, that's when you can try some soothing techniques. It's not your responsibility, but you're using your EQ. And that's when you can say, I'd love to share something with you. I know it might be hard to hear and it's hard for me to say. I'd really love if you could listen and try to, I'm going to try to get this out the best I can. Or even asking, can I share something with you that might be hard? Or can I give you some feedback on that? Asking for that permission first typically gets people in a mindset. They're kind of preparing themselves. I think about if it was in real time and I was going to say, hey, do you mind if I give the two of you feedback? You could say no. And I'd be like, all right, fair enough. 9 out of 10 people, because we're curious and we're like, whoa, what's happening, would say yes. But you're already priming yourself. You're already getting yourself somewhat prepared, even though you don't know maybe what I'm going to say, that like, okay, I need to be in the receiving mode rather than me just jumping in perhaps with some critical feedback. Your responses were going to be very different if I had to take a guess, because guess what? You're human and we all have egos.
Leah, that gave me chills. I felt soothed when you said that. So I if you have any other soothing techniques, please share them now, because I think that was genius.
Yeah, having friends is it's tough emotional work, huh? a lot to do. I'm wondering how you know when it's time to maybe end a friendship, whether it's like, oh, I feel depleted every time I talk to this person, or this person carries a balloon arch all the time. I'm over it. How do you know when it's that time? And then how do you do that? I've never had a friend breakup conversation. Is that a thing we owe our friends?
I think so, depending on the situation. Obviously, if it's something that's like, whoa, that crossed all of my boundaries and I feel psychologically unsafe, that's a different story. But I do think this tendency now to just ghost, this tendency to be like, oh, well, like, come on, that's such a cop out. That shit will follow you around. So that cycle's going to continue. You're going to have it done to you probably at some point. I just feel like it's such a cop out that people are just executing way more than need be. Again, it's circumstantial, but I think we owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our friendships. We owe it to our relationships. It's also like we're lacking, therefore, reps in those really uncomfortable areas. We need them. And I think, again, if we're not addressing things as we go, which is so hard to do, it's easier said than done, especially if you do have a fierce inner pleaser, like you're constantly accommodating or justifying or being like, it's fine. It's fine. They're a good friend. It's fine. I just always feel bad after I leave, but it's fine. Like that's more so your work. And I think if I'm taking a little bit of a tangent, thinking about if you are in a relationship, friendship or otherwise, that you're just feeling constantly depleted. You feel like it's incredibly imbalanced most of the time, and resentment is flourishing. Resentment equals lack of boundaries. That's a given. If you feel resentful, your boundaries are not strong enough. They're not strong enough at all. And so that's when we say things, even to those friends that we feel like they're bulldozing over us, or they always get their side. It's those types of things where we communicate, you know what, I'm trying something. I've noticed that I don't speak up, or I've noticed that I'm doing this, and I'm going to really try to practice this. I'm going to try to practice this in whatever. If you have a friend that's like, cool, okay, I wasn't aware of that, but let's do it. If you have a friend that is like incredibly defensive on that, when you try to set a boundary or introduce something or share some self-exploration that you're on, and they're just like, nope, that's threatening to me, that's not going to work, that's a really good indicator that that might not be a great relationship for you.
But you love her and you want to help her and you want to pop the balloon arch in a great way that she's like doesn't stand in her own way and she can have healthy relationships. That's my problem. But one thing that you said that I have to ask, when you say, oh, we just like, oh, it's fine. How do you know when this is silly? It's going to pass. It's not something I have to bring up versus, okay, this is something I should bring up because the longer that I sit with it, the more resentment it's going to be. How do you figure that out?
Great question. I mean, I think a lot of it is that if there's a cycle that you've identified, and more so if it's a one-off and you're kind of like, ooh, that was weird. That was confusing. Like, let me chew on that a little bit. Okay, cool. Yeah. Let me give myself a 24-hour rule. If it's something where you're like, it happened again, and my anxiety's through the roof and and you're just like, it's just a repetitive thing. There's a big difference in that, isn't there? And so I think it is, I even know something that's been very helpful in my marriage to disclose is that when something happens and I'm triggered, I have started to say, Leah, give yourself 24 hours. Ooh. And if it's still brewing and it is brewing and it's even brewing maybe more, yeah, it's time to speak up. If it's something where I'm like, you know what? I'm going to let that one slide, but I collected some data. Like it's not, I'm going to use that later, like vindictive, but thinking about that, because as well as I do, sometimes when we're triggered, we're thinking emotionally and we say things. And unfortunately, as females, sometimes we pull out all the things from the past because we've been triggered and all these emotions.
PowerPoint, screenshots, timeline. Got it.
And we just like, all of our suppression bubbles are like, hey, this is our time. And we just come out, right? And so thinking about, let me give my logical side a chance to intermingle with my emotional side so that if and when I do need to present this and advocate for myself or share this, I'm going to be more balanced. I'm going to make more sense. I'm going to be more thoughtful rather than just impulsively spewing and possibly creating more hurdles for myself in my relationship.
I love that. Let emotion tag logic in. Well, like both tagged. I love that. I love that visual. One of the most popular things that I was seeing people searching on Google is how to make friends as an adult. So how do we make friends? We're on our phones. We've got our loneliness. Everyone has ditched us for husbands and cute children, whatever. But whatever stage of life you're actually in. But how do we get new friends as an adult?
Especially when you hate small talk and all of that. How do you get,
Are you work from home? Like whatever. Yeah, all the things. All the things.
And you're not going to like this answer, but I do. I'm not a small talker either.
Thank you for prepping us though that we aren't going to like it because you told us. You did it.
Some of this small talk, if you think about it, even the simple like, man, the weather, it's so hot today, or it looks like it's going to rain. We use things in the current environment with someone that we know that we can immediately relate with them on. So, oh my gosh, look at that cute dog. Or wow, you're on an airplane. It's like, oh man, it looks like we're going to be late with takeoff. You're immediately pulling something out that you can relate to with them because in real time, you're both experiencing that. And so that's a little bit of your warm up to hopefully get a little deeper or assess if you even want to get a little deeper, right? And so that's that small talk. If you think about it, it's kind of like a warm up before a workout. So I think sometimes acknowledging, as much as a lot of people would say, I don't really like small talk, it seems inauthentic, it seems this and this and this. It's a way to create, I think, this foundation sometimes out of nothing, because this could be a stranger. This could be someone that you're at like a brewery and you're doing game night and you state the obvious, like, oh, looks like we're gonna be playing this, or do you come here a lot, or whatever. You're gathering a little bit of data. You're assessing, like, are they making eye contact? Do they feel this? Are they approachable? Do they think I'm approachable? Your mind is creating all of these associations. So I think sometimes that's where I tell a lot of this to my clients who they're like, oh, but I'm like, what risk are you going to take this week? What risk are you going to take? Yeah. Whether that is talking to a stranger, whether that is going and riding your bike in a different area, whether that's, if you do work from home, going to a different coffee shop every week. And it's like, oh God, that sounds exhausting. And then I'm just going to find someone but like, think about too, in the interview process, they're like, keep interviewing. It just takes that one. Think about that with friends. Think about that with new people. And is it tiresome? Sure, but you're getting reps in, you're collecting data about yourself, you're interacting with your environment, and you are being present rather than hiding away with, I got enough friends, even though they live all over the country and I don't see them ever. I'm good to go. And it's like, yeah, you're missing out on that real-time energy exchange.
Oh my gosh, I love that. What risk are you going to take? So what I've loved throughout this conversation, and Bob's has picked it up because she's a quick learner, doing the reps. Okay, so when it comes to friendships, what reps should we be doing? What should be our routine? What are our reps?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things is to really be real with how much of your social interaction is through your device, right? How much are you using energy to stay connected with people that you actually already have a foundation with, or just that fabricated connection? Be real with that. And maybe it's a lot, and maybe you check in and you're like, ooh, that's a pretty obscene amount. Maybe you can chip away with that. You can reallocate some of that space. And you can, again, kind of invite the uncomfortable or discomfort and put yourself in different environments. You're signing up for something. And I know this sounds like, oh God, no, we're over that. That's what we did in school. But it's like, that stuff works. Like, that stuff works as much as we're like, ugh. But thinking about putting ourselves out there. So I would, again, say the reps, the risks, embrace that discomfort, and just, again, don't hide away from it. When you can make eye contact with someone and smile and get that energy, do it. It's not always this like, oh, well, I'm too busy or I need this for recovery. It's like, see what can happen. I mean, think about those times. I know I'm so guilty of this, where like, if I do have something socially planned, especially on a Friday night, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to go, I'm so tired. But every time I go, I'm good. Like, it was fun. Or I'm like, yeah, or that was good. Or, it wasn't awful. Like and I think we got to remind ourselves and create a new narrative around just getting out there.
I love that. Okay. Anything else our audience needs to know?
I hear it time and time again. Something hovered around that loneliness of just like, yeah, I have acquaintances. I feel like I have relationships, or I don't feel like I have any at all. And I feel like I'm isolated in that. I feel like everyone else is good to go. They got their crew, they got their clique, they got their relationships, and I'm kind of solo. And I want to just validate that that's not true. I think a lot of people are struggling with that and struggling with, where do I find my people? Where do I do that? But I think that's where we do need to take those risks of just connecting, even if it's in situations where you're like, I'm never going to meet anybody here, but just connect and don't have these high unrealistic expectations that you're going to find your soulmate or your best friend. You're just exchanging energy. You're getting reps. And as well as I do, sometimes when someone says, hey, I love your shirt, or like they smile at you, it does something to us.
Yeah.
Is it this huge change? No, but it makes our day like, it's a form of connection. So I think just knowing you're not alone, but we all got to take a step. We all got to carry our part.
Oh my gosh, I love this. And this is why I'm going to continue to carry deodorant in my purse, because it gives me anxiety talking to people. But that's the best, right? When you like say a joke and nobody looks up in a room and you're like, oh, that was good. But we've got to put ourselves out there. I love it so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So such helpful advice.
I want to thank Leah for chatting with us today. I know I learned a lot. Bobs, what's one thing you're going to take away?
I learned so much. I thought Leah was great. I feel like I'm going to say a couple things. I loved how she framed. I always think of like talking to someone in the waiting room. Like, I don't want to do that, but I love how she framed it as reps. It's like you're always getting better. And what you said at the beginning of we're just trying to get a little bit better. Maybe that's all you do that day to like practice connection. Just talk to the person at the bus stop. But I just loved the idea of even that is self-improvement. And then resentment equals lack of boundaries. I think that's a revolutionary thing because I just never thought of that in that way. And I guess I should leave some stuff for you to take away.
No, but really, did you have anything else to say? Because I think that only reiterates to all of our listeners now that we've gone viral with the bots, how special these conversations are. So if you have more, you are a testimony. You say more.
The last thing was when she said she asks her clients, what risk are you going to take today? If we all asked ourselves that every day, what could our lives, what could the world look like? We don't do that much. So let's start doing that. What about you? What did you take away?
Okay. So obviously, that's going to make me say, what risk are you going to take this week? I want to hear from you and I want to hear it from everybody else too. But Bobs, what risk are you going to, I'm sweating as I ask you.
Oh my gosh. I don't know. I think I have to think about it.
Sorry, no, you think while I talk, as Leah said, listening is important. You think while I talk. No, I think the risk thing was so great too, because as we talk about here, it is marginal improvement, as James Clear has taught us, tiny little things, consistency, doable things. So, what risk are you taking this week? And it's not tightrope walking over the Grand Canyon. It's like, can you extend yourself to have a conversation, a small chat, a small comment with a stranger? So what risk will we take? I will say my risk will be I had no plans for any social outing with young people this weekend. It was like, I'm going to do something with my mom. I'm going to do some work. That's my weekend. So I will say the risk, I will attempt to put myself in a social situation with people my own age and venture out on an evening.
on an evening.
Like if I could be as specific and weird at the same time, I will venture out into my community on an evening over the weekend night. Great.
I hope when you're in this social situation, you talk exactly like that.
That's why I have no friends. That's the need for friends.
I guess I'll do something similar. I only have to go into work one day a week and they do it. So we'll like bond and stuff, but I always just like sit in a conference room. So maybe this week I kind of have this attitude of like, whatever, I'm not going to make any new friends at this point. I have a friend, but maybe I'll join the lunch this week. Make some small talk.
Look at you.
Think of it as some reps.
I loved that. Do your reps. I can't love it more. We want to know, audience, what is your risk for this week? What feels risky? What feels doable for you? Maybe you have to reach for your purse deodorant, but what are you going to do? And in addition to that, we would love to hear if you had a favorite nugget from the show. Let us know on Instagram at Most Self-Improved, all one word. We look forward to connecting. And one nice thing you can do for a friend, since this is all about friendships, if you are enjoying this episode, this show, share it with them, subscribe to the show, leave a review. Bhavana and I would appreciate it. Your little podcast friends as we are. We thank you for tuning in and we hope you have a great, risky, healthy, safe, whatever, but risky week. Everybody, thank you.
Have a risky week, friends. Bye.